Welcome to the Book Loft Presents Conversation with. Today's guest is the Pulitzer finalist and award-winning journalist for the Louisville Courier-Journal, who's also a former sports writer for the Berlin Bureau of the New York Times, and is the writer of several best-selling sports books, including Rock Solid, My Life in Baseball's Fast Lane, and 9 Innings to Success, amongst others. Alan Maimon's latest book is Twilight Enhancered, an Appalachian Reckoning. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
As your bio indicates, you have a background in sports, in sports writing. You were in the Berlin Bureau of the New York Times, covering sports in that area. So I guess the first question kind of started off is, what does a Philly guy writing in Berlin, how does he get into Hazard, Kentucky?
I've always been interested in sports and sports writing. The sports writing that I did in the Berlin Bureau of the New York Times was the type of sports writing that sort of went beyond the box scores and kind of looked at the larger cultural significance of athletics. And one story in particular that I did when I was living in Berlin was about female swimmers who had competed in the Olympics and other championship meets for the former East Germany. And I really got to know some of these women well. They were in their 40s by the time I met them. But at the time that they competed for East Germany, they were young teenagers who were being pumped full of all sorts of anabolic steroids and other performance enhancing drugs, which had left a crippling effect on them later in life. So with the sports writing, I've always looked at it as a window into larger cultural phenomena. Not to say that I haven't written about the lighter side of sports too, and that more is a byproduct of my other journalism, which has tended to lean towards very heavy subjects. It's nice sometimes to flick off that switch and lose yourself in just in a lighter sports story. But the sports stories that I enjoyed doing most were the ones that had a more serious societal impact. And in some ways, the stories that I wrote from the former East Germany about these swimmers set me up nicely for the job that I ended up taking in Eastern Kentucky. Because I think, as we all know, the image that most people have of the swimmer, the female swimmer in the former East Germany, is very much a caricature of this muscle-bound, deep-voiced person. And it's quite frankly, it's very insulting. I got to know these women quite well, and they were very much human beings with tragic backstories. And I think I took my that experience really informed my experience in Eastern Kentucky, a place also very much subject to caricature and stereotype in different media. And I tried to bring a much fuller portrayal of the area to the stories that I did for the Louisville paper.
Absolutely. And so before we get into kind of like a deeper conversation about the book, I want to kind of go a little further into the book to kind of give us the context of how important the kind of journalism that you were doing in your time at the Louisville Courier-Journal really highlights a way of combating those kind of caricatures that you're talking about. So you're kind of like at the end of your run at the journal, you're kind of at the kind of like the shift, a paradigm shift in media consumption, in media, in journalism and newspapers, and you're experiencing some kind of like very cataclysmic kind of changes in that forum. And so, can you talk about how first how economic incentives kind of not necessarily I guess in certain ways do a disservice to the kind of journalism that journalists such as yourself are doing, but how it kind of like shapes and molds the kind of media that will ultimately get consumed by communities. And then to further along with that question, can you speak about how the loss of the Hazard Bureau in Kentucky, how that affects a community like that overall?
Sure. So to set the stage, I was with the Courier Journal in the Eastern Kentucky Bureau from late 2000 to early 2006. And these were very pivotal years in the newspaper industry. There was a lot of hand wringing going on about the emergence of online media and what that would mean for traditional print media. And some of the ideas that were implemented at newspapers may not have been the most far-sighted in terms of really fulfilling the public service mission that newspapers have always had. So I was the last Eastern Kentucky reporter for the Courier Journal. When the Courier Journal closed its Hazard Bureau in early 2006, the New York Times actually did a story about its closure because it was such a legendary bureau that had served this impoverished and distressed region for so many years and really helped keep officials there accountable. So yeah, there was a real paradigm shift going on during this time, and it left a void. Since the Courier Journal closed its Hazard Bureau, there have been other media outlets that have covered Eastern Kentucky. There's the Lexington Herald Leader, but they've backed off from it a little bit as well. The Associated Press closed its Pikeville Bureau in Eastern Kentucky a number of years ago. So it's really a distressing thing because democracy dies in darkness, I think is a phrase we've all become familiar with. It's kind of what the Washington Post has adopted as their moniker. And I'll just say this, when the Hazard Bureau of the Courier Journal closed, the then mayor of Hazard compared the paper's importance to that of the Bible, the Courier Journal and the Bible, in terms of its importance to the people of Eastern Kentucky. And it was a shame. Now this book is obviously a book that was 15 to 20 years in the making, because ever since I left Eastern Kentucky with a large sense that my business there was unfinished, hardly a day has passed when I haven't thought about the people, the places, and the issues that I covered while I was there. And that's kind of all wrapped together into this book.
Absolutely. And you really get a sense of this being kind of an extension of the work that you were doing while you were in Eastern Kentucky. And I think it really does a good job of kind of dispelling a lot of like stereotypes and kind of mythologies that kind of are just constantly in the public consciousness about the region. And I guess, in kind of starting this conversation, one of the things that, Eastern Kentucky or Appalachia in general is kind of known for is its relationship with coal. And it's a very complex one. And I think some of the things that I really appreciate about the book are you really go into a kind of historical analysis first, both contemporary and, in terms of like, late 19th century, early 20th century kind of history of the region in regards to its relationship with coal and kind of the predatory practices that, where it kind of affects, the relationship between the people, community, and coal. Can you talk about what that kind of like predatory practice, how that affected people in the region? And then can you also talk about how there's a little misconception that it's kind of like there's this blind allegiance to coal within the region, and you really see a lot of really interesting people in the book, especially a guy named like Tony Opegard. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And kind of the work that he did along with the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund. Can you speak on that?
Sure. So let's also acknowledge that some of the things that you've heard about Eastern Kentucky are true. Okay, why? That's really, I think, one of the fundamental questions in the book is why are things the way they are? The Twilight and Hazard is a deep dive into that question. So absolutely, we need to talk about the historic stranglehold that the coal industry has had on the region. Now, primarily what I look at in the book is the recent history of the region from, let's say, 2000 to today. A real interesting time, because the coal industry perceived its hold on the region slipping. Market forces had a lot to do with that. Coal just wasn't as common of a source of electricity that it used to be. However, the culture of coal, so there was this idea that the industry needed to kind of preserve its hegemony over the culture. And as you alluded to, there were forces pushing back against that. There were people like Tony Opegard, who was one of the nation's preeminent mine safety experts and advocates. You also had groups like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, who were fighting very noble environmental fights against the environmental toll of coal mining. So to combat those voices, you had the coal industry kind of coming together and creating this, and I write about this in the book, this Friends of Coal movement. And watching the dynamics between the Friends of Coal movement up against the growing recognition that coal not only sullies the environment, but it also kills the miners who work in the mines, sometimes cataclysmically and suddenly, other times over the course of many years through black lung. My father-in-law died in his early 50s of black lung. I saw that up close and personal. Now, I'll also say that it's important, if you're really trying to understand the region, to understand the cultural importance that coal has to the region. You can't rip a Band-Aid right off when it comes to this. I think in order to get everybody in the region on board with a transition narrative, one that looks past coal, one that looks past one that looks to a post-coal economy, you have to do so delicately. And I think that's really important. And I try to make that point in the book. When Hillary Clinton says in 2016, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work, that's a dicey proposition. That's ignoring how important coal is to the ethos of people in Eastern Kentucky. What she went on to say is absolutely correct. We need to transition these workers into other areas, clean energy. But if you sort of create this an us versus them situation with coal, I'm not sure it gets us to where we need to be. And where we need to be is in Eastern Kentucky that has a more diverse economy. That's how we start trying to get past the persistent, poverty that the region has experienced for many generations. So yeah, coal is very much in the background of almost everything that I write about in Twilight and Hazard.
And to kind of go back on that idea that you're talking about, the kind of like the delicacy of the relationship between coal and the community, I think what was very striking to me, I think it's something that even as a person who had studied in the Appalachian diaspora of southern Ohio, I think it just kind of like rang like just like a light bulb went off in my head, was this idea of like honoring the kind of sacrifices that these people had put into this industry. And I think that's something that even like the most well-meaning politicians, whether it be kind of like center-left politicians like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, to even far progressive politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I think they kind of, like as you're saying, they're talking about this like transition, but I don't think they recognize the kind of like the devotion and the cost, not only from like a single individual, but from a generational perspective, that these people have put into coal. And by not being as empathetic or as understanding of that kind of dynamic, do you think that politicians who would otherwise have better outcomes electorally in the region, do you think they leave a lot on the table by not doing that?
I think that you hit the nail on the head there. Empathy is crucial. This is a very delicate subject matter. One thing that was very sobering to me during my 5 years covering Eastern Kentucky every day was the number of coal miners with black lung who I spoke to. Coal miners who literally were taking some of their last breaths, who said to me, man, I just wish I could get back into the mines. That I just wish I could go back underground one more time. Think about that. that speaks to how ingrained it's more than just a profession. It's really so integral to understanding the history and the societal impact of coal mining in Eastern Kentucky. So yes, I would agree with what you said wholeheartedly, that we can't, in order to talk to each other, we need to show more empathy. We need to acknowledge that if your daddy and your granddaddy and your great granddaddy all worked in the coal mines, that's very much a part of who you are, and that's important. That's probably not what your kids are going to be doing. So let's talk about what's next.
And I think to kind of continue on with like this idea of like misconceptions, I thought was something that was really interesting. Was and you talk about it, is the idea that the kind of the struggles of Eastern Kentucky may not necessarily be the struggles that is representative of the state in general, and that they're almost kind of like in this kind of like caste system where their identity as a whole is kind of almost kind of used against them in their own home. And so you really home in on this idea of dialect language as a means to kind of like it's like a further kind of consternation against people, specifically that of the Eastern Kentucky region. Can you talk about how that goes about and some of the people that you spoke to in your book about this kind of dynamic?
Yeah, this stemmed from my own experience after arriving in Hazard and traveling around Eastern Kentucky. I took note of how often people would say to me, "You talk proper." I was told this again and again, and you talk proper. And I thought about this, and I had just moved from Germany, where I was speaking German, pretty comfortably, and nobody really commented on my dialect in German. And here I am, I'm back, wow, I'm in the United States, and here I am speaking my native language, and people are commenting on it, that you talk proper. So anyway, that was a window into the whole idea of identity and dialect. I ended up doing a story about how some people in the region were actually going to lengths to lose their dialect, which in my opinion was a huge shame, because it's a wonderful dialect. It's a fascinating dialect. I'm not a linguist, but I know enough about it to realize it's a very special dialect. But there were people who thought that they might not get the job that they wanted if they spoke a certain way, especially if they left the region. That their dialect would be commented on constantly. I talked to many people who said, yeah, whenever I went up to Ohio for the summer, I was incessantly made fun of because of the way I spoke. This is a little bit of an aside, but for anybody who's watched the HBO show Mayor of Easttown, I found that to be a fascinating window into language. I'm from the Philadelphia area. This show really put the Philadelphia dialect kind of on the map in a way where it hasn't been put before. So I'm very interested in dialect, and in particular in Eastern Kentucky, where there's been very little in-migration over the course of the last couple of 100 years. What's developed there is a very unique dialect, a very special dialect that some people feel like they're better off without.
Absolutely.
Let me say, but that most people are extremely proud of.
Absolutely. I have a lot of friends who come from that region who are very proud of, their accents. They're proud of, their background. And I think there is a growing movement amongst people, especially the young people in that area, to reclaim that kind of regional pride and to show that they are more than the kind of caricatures that are portrayed throughout the country. And so I wanted to ask in regards to just kind of like, again, speaking about the community and the kind of dynamics within, Eastern Kentucky. You're talking about looking beyond what life in the region will be like kind of post coal. And you're kind of seeing there's still kind of like this it's almost kind of phased out like within Eastern Kentucky, just because of like strip mining and mountaintop removal. But what you're seeing now is that kind of Western Kentucky is kind of taken up its kind of coal mantle. And I thought what was really surprising in the book, almost kind of shook me, was, we tend to talk about like the kind of, the kind of dynamics of just kind of like us versus them mentality in regards to kind of like a national conversation, between the the metropolises that are, getting fueled with coal. But something that really surprised me was that 50% of all Western coal that are coming from Western Kentucky are going into places like China. And so, how does that kind of like how does that dynamic, that kind of international dynamic, globalization, how does that play a role into what coal mining looks like in the next, 5, 10, 15 years?
I think one of the statistics in the book is that in 2019, there was more coal mined in state of Illinois than in the state of Kentucky. So, right, a lot of Wyoming coal is going to China. But because of market forces speak quite loudly, as do certain environmental regulations that have impacted coal mining. Now, if you want to talk about this from a political standpoint, the boogeyman, the anti-coal boogeyman was Barack Obama. The people of the region turned Barack Obama into this anti-coal boogeyman that in many cases he really wasn't. They blamed Barack Obama for every downturn in the coal industry out there, when in fact market forces really spoke far louder than any environmental regulation that the Obama administration advocated for. But that was important because when I was in Eastern Kentucky from 2000 to 2005, when I was there every day, I should say, because I still am back there quite often because my wife is from Harlan County. But when I was there every day, there were still pockets of blue. There were still pockets of blue in Eastern Kentucky. That really stopped while I was there and really came to a screeching halt in 2008 when Barack Obama was first elected. That congressional district that covers Eastern Kentucky is now the reddest in the country. And a lot of that has to do with the vilification of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. We're talking vote tallies for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 that were close to 90% in some of these counties. And coal, as with so much else going on in Eastern Kentucky, plays a really big role in determining the politics of the region. There's also a big element of the urban-rural divide that isn't just specific to Eastern Kentucky. I think Twilight and Hazard tries to talk about Eastern Kentucky in a larger framework of urban-rural divide. That to say that that's an issue in our country right now would be an understatement. The polarization of this country is it's an extraordinary thing. I think most people have noticed it.
Oh, absolutely. I think polarization is one of the things that just kind of dominates the cultural landscape of this country, and it's definitely not getting better. And so to kind of continue on that train of thought, what are kind of the people in the region? What are the kind of things that they're doing to kind of transition themselves, or at least preparing themselves for the eventual kind of move beyond coal, kind of the post-coal era of Appalachia, and more specifically, Eastern Kentucky?
Well, the first major step, and I kind of contrast the way economic development leaders were talking 15 years ago with the way they're talking now. 15 years ago, I felt like a lot of the talk about creating a post-coal economy was lip service. I felt like coal still just loomed too large, and too many leaders were scared to really talk seriously about the urgency of creating a post-coal economy. I think now there are some really bright, visionary economic leaders in the area who are talking about creating a blueprint for a post-coal economy. And really the goals, I think, are fairly straightforward. You want to create a situation make the area so that outsiders would like to visit there, that companies would like to locate there, and that, and this is important, that young people would like to stay there and start their own businesses there. And I write about in the book about how a clean and hospitable Eastern Kentucky is going to go a long way towards creating that type of Eastern Kentucky. The area has been beset for a long time with quite, let's just call it what it is, a litter problem, a big litter problem. You drive over the Kentucky border into Appalachian sections of Virginia, for example, and it's a lot cleaner. Some communities in Eastern Kentucky haven't done a great job of keeping their communities clean. And you see it in the streams. You see old refrigerators dumped into the creeks. You see that less now, and that's really important, because a clean, hospitable Eastern Kentucky is going to be the kind of Eastern Kentucky that can develop a future and capitalize on its uniqueness and on some of its inherent advantages, despite some of the mountains getting their tops chopped off because of mountaintop removal. It's still a beautiful area.
Right. And I think there's like this belief that, amongst the people there that, those are kinds of, mountaintop removal is a very harmful thing, but like eventually nature will kind of have its way and be able to regrow, and you'll see more trees kind of like growing back in within the region. And speaking of this idea of like young, more young, new, dynamic leaders within Kentucky specifically, you kind of towards the end of the book, kind of I was kind of wondering like where you kind of started off with like this pro wrestler, and you're kind of going in like some like interesting directions. I'm kind of like wondering to myself like, where is this like gonna go? This is a really interesting way to end the book. And I want to highlight one of the people that you talk about in that last chapter, and his name is Charles Booker. I think he's someone that specifically in this part of the country, especially like Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, has gained kind of like a national prominence through social media. And what does it say, or at least give me your opinion of how you interpret like the emergence of someone like Charles Booker in the region, and how that could be a good thing for the region overall.
Yeah. Well, I was sort of documenting his emergence in real time, because as I was finishing up the book, Charles Booker was making this running this really impressive campaign to become the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate. In which case, if he had prevailed, he would have gone up against Mitch McConnell in the general election. He fell a little bit short in the primary to a woman named Amy McGrath, but Charles Booker is very much now an up and coming rising political star. I think he's made no secrets about the fact that he would like to run against Rand Paul in 2022 for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Charles Booker's motto is "From the hood to the holler." We need to lift voices from the hood to the holler. He really draws a connection between the community he is from in the urban west side of Louisville with some of the structural and systemic forces that have been at play over the years in Eastern Kentucky. What impressed me was his last day on the campaign trail before the primary election last year. He spent it in Eastern Kentucky. He spent it in two places, Hazard and Pikeville. I think he understands that some of the problems that people have experienced in urban parts of Louisville are comparable to some of the problems people have experienced in Eastern Kentucky. Now, both he and I think, would both agree that the historical background it could not be more different. There is no systemic racism at play in largely white Eastern Kentucky. However, there are structural and systemic economic forces that have been at play in both urban and rural areas of distress that should bring these blocks of voters together. And I think he's trying to do that.
And I think that's something that I think a lot of people fail to recognize, especially kind of our political institutions? And do you think that the kind of his kind of activism and his work, and the campaign that he'd run and presumably will run in 12 months' time, do you think that's something that can capture the attention of, like, say, the Democratic Party, and it's something that they can replicate, not only for just Eastern Kentucky, but like West Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, and other places that have rural communities?
I know Charles Booker thinks that it could be a regional model. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. Clearly, there are still social issue wedges that throw a little bit of throw this into a little bit of a disarray in terms of social issues. For example, there's a county in Eastern Kentucky that recently became what they call a Second Amendment sanctuary county. Just in case the federal government ever comes for their guns, they now have a local ordinance that standing up against that. So when you're talking about wedge issues that obviously have played such a large role in determining elections, whether it be gun ownership, abortion rights, and so forth, that's kind of the wild card here. If you're looking strictly at what's in people's economic best interests, then to me, it's a no-brainer that these rather diverse blocks of voters should be able to find common ground. The next question, though, is can we look past these wedge issues that are called wedge issues for a reason? They're there to basically divide the electorate.
I think one of the things that was really surprising for me in the book, especially in kind of like getting into like the wedge issue, is kind of how Big Pole likes to play a heavy hand in pushing the wedge. And I guess I would want to ask is, like, how do activists in the area kind of combat that kind of it almost comes across as like Big Brother to me in a certain way, in the sense that, like, softball games have coal company logos. People, I think one of the most heartbreaking things that I read in the book was you're describing this man who you're trying to interview, who has just had like a piece of rock, a giant boulder, essentially crash into his home, and he's not going to talk to you out of fear of retaliation because his sibling or his cousin or someone he knows may be on the firing end of his speaking out. What are the ways that you kind of go combat that? It seems almost Big Brother like to me in reading that.
Well, the environmental activists who have been fighting this fight for years now, and who I admire greatly because the victories have been relatively few and far between until recently. Again, it goes back to market forces. Coal is on the downturn. It's very unlikely that coal is going to boom again. The boom bust cycle that has been around for over 100 years seems to have landed on bust, and it's not coming back. Rather than gloating, I think the important thing to do now is to take a step back, because there is begrudging acceptance among leaders now who they never 15 years ago never would have been as outspoken as they are now about their recognition that coal isn't coming back. What you're talking about is absolutely correct. This real sort of propagandistic, pushing of coal into every segment of life there. But it's almost like, I guess I would draw an analogy to when the Soviet Union collapsed. And for a little while after they tried to maintain this kind of this facade of great power, but it was over. It was over. Now what came in to fill the void is perhaps a cautionary tale. But in some ways, the same thing applies to coal. Coal has had this historic dominance, which has ended. The smart environmental activists are not gloating. They are looking to, because they care. At their core, they care about Eastern Kentucky. I think they're asking a lot of the same questions that I'm asking and that you're asking of me in terms of, okay, now that we've sort of turned the page on coal, what can we do to make Eastern Kentucky's economy as healthy as it possibly can be?
Right, and I think there's this. I think, especially for people that I know in the diaspora, there's this kind of concern of like, okay, you've seen you're left behind. You're kind of decimated by an opioid crisis that has, either sent your best and brightest away to prison or has outright just killed your best and brightest. Um, you feel left behind by that. You have watched strip mining to destroy the land further, and you've paid a cost in that. And so there's almost kind of like this innate fear of like, oh, well, without coal, what is the identity of Appalachia beyond that? And so I guess to kind of wrap this up, um, what are ways people can there's going to be a moment where we're kind of post McConnell, we're kind of post Cole, and there's, like as you said, there will be a vacuum and the void fill. Where can this go right, and where can it go wrong if we're not paying attention?
Where it can go right is through a holistic effort, and the federal government can play a role. The federal government isn't the be all end all in terms of Eastern Kentucky. President Lyndon Johnson came to Eastern Kentucky to kick off his war on poverty over 50 years ago. And the federal government since then has played a role. The Jobs Act that recently passed can help Eastern Kentucky. A Marshall Plan for coal country that was introduced by Senator Tammy Duckworth last year can help coal country. Local leadership has a huge role to play here. Public corruption in among local officials in Eastern Kentucky has been rampant in the last 20 years and before that. So if local government has to clean up its act. And then there's a role for communities to play. I was alluding earlier to just simply cleaning up the landscape. That's important. This is an area that should have all sorts of bed and breakfasts and cabins because it's a beautiful area. Unfortunately, sometimes it's just not the cleanest area. So there's a role for everybody to play here. And I'm glad you brought up the opioid epidemic because that's an enormous part of the book. That was the last thing that area needed. And it hit right after I arrived there. And I saw the opioid epidemic take an area that was struggling and just kick it into overdrive in terms of tearing the fabric of communities even further apart. So thankfully, and thankfully that has been on the decline in the past few years. Hopefully nothing will reemerge like it. There are more places for people to go to get help now. When I was there 15, 20 years ago, there were hardly any places for people to go to get clean. So it really requires a holistic effort. Where things can go wrong would be if any one of those things falters. The subtitle of the book is An Appalachian Reckoning. And I believe a reckoning requires us to ask ourselves some very difficult and sometimes uncomfortable questions. That's a real reckoning. It's not just a word we throw around to make ourselves feel like we're doing things. We need to fundamentally reimagine a lot of things, not just in Eastern Kentucky. I think Eastern Kentucky is a window into our entire country in terms of reimagining who we are and what we value as a nation. So let's start with Eastern Kentucky. Let's make Eastern Kentucky a model for what we can do to make things better. Because it's obviously a region I care a lot about, and if you read the book, I think that'll shine through. I feel like it's not always the brightest of it. There's a lot of bleakness in there, but I think there's a lot of empathy in there too. And to go back to the very beginning of what we talked about, I think it answers a lot of the why of this. Like why are things the way they are? And hopefully it will give people a deeper understanding of that.
I really hope so. This book, I think, is very important in a time where there are very negative and toxic kind of caricatures or looks of the region and of the people there. They're good people. I've lived in the diaspora. I have friends who have family that live in that region. They're worthy of dignity and success and prosperity. And I think that having positive representations, or not necessarily just positive, it's like honest, truth, fact-based representations of the region is a good start in getting people to understand what's going on there. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation today. And I'm glad that we're able to put it out there for the people to see, to read, and to understand. I hope that that a positive reckoning will come, and that the people of that region will see the other side of it on a better and positive note.
Thank you very much. That is certainly my hope as well.
Absolutely. Well, the book is called Twilight and Hazard, an Appalachian Reckoning. It's by Alan Maimon, and we will have a link down at the bottom of the video where you can get signed copies at bookloft.com. Once again, Alan Maimon, thank you for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.